Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Captain Lisowski welcomes you all. Today is Saturday, July 27th, the day of recording, and I hope that this material will be released today as well. My guest, as you will soon find out, is someone who knows a lot about what is happening in the East, how things are unfolding there, and what conclusions can be drawn from it. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest is Colonel Maciej KOROWAJ. Welcome warmly, Maciej.
I warmly welcome you all. I warmly welcome you, Captain Maciej.
Colonel, from time to time, you occasionally release some nice things that are not yet fully completed, but are an interesting excerpt from the things you are working on. Recently, you made 3 of those. And looking at all of this, putting these elements together, the picture of Russia starts to become quite, maybe not completely, but more and more pieces of the puzzle begin to fit together at a time when Russia is by no means fully transparent, as there are various problems, different concepts for solving these problems, internal changes, external actions and circumstances, both macro and micro, are all changing in this. You focus on what you like the most: issues of organization, capabilities, structures, and similar things, as well as how all of this functions, where we can find a reflection of this in ourselves. And you have recently dealt with these things, and if you like it, I encourage you to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Captain Lisowski's channel. And I also encourage you to follow what Maciej KOROWAJ writes on his Twitter profile, to follow Captain's Twitter profile and to support the creativity of independent creators, because without that it will be weak, and corporations lately primarily focus on puppies, kittens, and similar things. Although I love both, but you can't live on just that. And you, Maciej, brought up a great point, because I would start with one, probably from the top. In this case, that is the strategy of the Russian Federation. You quoted a statement by Evgeny Fedorov, a Russian author, analyst, and publicist, who summarized what, how, and why in a really great summary, explaining why and how Russia operates. And here I would like to give you the floor, because you invented exactly this fragment. You will break it down into its components the best.
Indeed. If I wanted to describe the strategy of the Russian Federation in a few words, Fedorov's words fit perfectly here. You would agree. If you have them somewhere, you can read them to us here, because I don't have that excerpt with me right now. It's the same, because it is quite short, but essentially fully describes the strategic thought of the Russian Federation regarding what is happening right now. If you could read it to our viewers, doing us the honor.
Absolutely, Maciej. I quote, "The only option for the Russian Federation is a pragmatic defense of its interests, considering its own economic potential. The Russian sphere of influence in the world is not that small, but it cannot be compared to the best years of the Soviet Union. I might try to discuss this 4-line verse now, because it refers to both history and the present, as well as to something that was fundamental in the broadly understood Russian doctrine, as it was not only related to military aspects, but its economic element was important, that is, firstly, Russia has no way out, meaning it is a determinant. There is always something against it, and it is forced.
But that is already normal. It is like a determinant of the functioning of the Russian Federation.
Of course, then yes, a pragmatic defense of one's interests. Pragmatism means that, if necessary, one can even temporarily align with the enemy, because there are more important interests. An example with the Taliban at the moment, right?
But also conducting actions in a way that I call balanced, meaning not overheating, not going for a strong collision just to overturn the table and gain nothing from it. That also should not derail the state.
Pragmatism is the opposite, I would say, of emotions. So at this moment, a cold calculation, we will add a little to the fire here, dampen it a little there, without emotions, effectively, unfortunately.
One step forward, two steps back, then again one step forward, then one step back, then two steps forward, one step back, and we are in place.
And no one says that you have to take the simplest route and go around.
I will also point out the issue that they refer to their economic potential, meaning they do not go beyond what they can handle in economic matters, which is very important.
Exactly. But their own economic potential largely consists of resources. The resources they possess, because they can manage them by exploiting them themselves or allowing others to exploit them, which can increase that potential. What does this mean? It is cooperation, an element of bidding, and so on. Furthermore, the Russian sphere of influence in the world is not small, but it cannot even be compared to what it was in the best times of the Soviet Union.
Pragmatism, indeed, pragmatism too.
Absolute pragmatism. They understand that it is not as good as it used to be, but they would not be themselves if they did not try to find their way back in those areas where they once were. Or planning among Russians can be long-term as well as deliberately uncovering resources left there. So, here are 4 sentences.
We have, that's why I decided not to change the quotes of what Fyodorov wrote, because it is essentially the essence, of what the Russian Federation is doing. And that's how I understand the actions of the Russian Federation. This determines all the other elements that I am examining, because here I will also paraphrase to say that I am literally a person who knows what is happening there. I try to be informed, but I do not know everything that is happening there. That is my humility, yes, however. The point is that this is like the engine and backbone of Russian actions. Here it is, so to speak. However, this is what they have. One could say this is what they have at the moment. This is the first sentence. The rest will refer, I will quote, to issues of the past, but also the future and what is happening at the moment.
I will therefore continue quoting. Another thing is that for the last decades, the unipolar hegemon, the USA, has tried to impose its own rules of the game on Russia, which are absolutely incomparable to its current potential. Simply put, Russia was treated like a moderately developed civilization. Washington has become somewhat intoxicated by our independence. Well, I will tell you that some things here made me wonder, because the unipolar world as such has indeed lost its dominance to a greater extent, as other, let's call them poles, have emerged. So, okay, the European Union is trying. Well, it is something that is trying to have that kind of role. China has absolutely advanced in every respect, since there is a firm belief that peace cannot be achieved in Europe at present without negotiating certain issues and involving China. That is, an Asian country. So, another pole, and the attempt to create a great collective pole in the form of BRICS and the broadly understood countries of the global south. So according to them, this unipolarity has indeed ended, but they did not mention one thing. As far as the goal of the existence of the USSR was to destroy this unipolarity, or rather, it was aware of the bipolarity at that time, the weakening of the American pole, which they did not succeed in, and they stumbled and fell. All of this is the result of others, including internal American factors, and not the merit of what once created the USSR. I would put it this way. So I am looking for that. On imposing rules of its own game on Russia, which are absolutely incomparable to its current potential. So it is said that the Americans have lost so many things that they are no longer able to impose their style of play on Russia, both in the economy and in politics.
Which shows, because note that despite the warnings from the United States, Russia started a war with Ukraine. We believe in the name of, despite the sanctions, it has been conducting this war for 2 years. Of course, it did not manage to achieve its war goals at the very beginning, but it is able to conduct this war for 2 years at a huge cost. That is a fact. But it is capable, and here Maciej also disagrees with you. I agree when it comes to the perception of the world, but I will look at it sitting on the walls of the Kremlin, and my legs are given to me by them. So I will look at this world from that side, and from this side, looking through the eyes of Russia at this world, it indeed looks like Russia is striving for that multipolar world I mentioned. Although it does not regard the European Union as some kind of dance, I will not agree with you here. It is we Europeans who want to think that way, but in the eyes of the Kremlin or in the eyes of Beijing, the European Union does not constitute a body that creates a pole. At least, that is how it is perceived by these two structures. However, here the key role of the United States is crucial. Russia has pain over the fact that the Soviet Union, which Putin has repeatedly mentioned in his statements or publications, and has spoken about this topic. However, what is Russia striving for? Russia is primarily striving for the fact that, listen, we have fallen apart, but the United States is no longer the Cold War United States. This is not the agency of the United States from 30 decades ago. It can indeed be said that the United States concluded with the Iraq War when they could not convince the remaining allies. I am talking about the remaining allies against intervention from the West, because France was opposed, as were many European countries. So here in this regard, Russia sees that, listen, you can no longer, I am speaking to Washington from the Kremlin side, impose your laws on us as the victor because you imposed them on us after the collapse. So now you must respect our approach to this. And here, Russia started to bid very high. You have often talked about how Russia bids and how it tries to achieve its goals. But this is the view sitting on the walls of the Kremlin from that perspective. And you can agree with it or not, but they perceive the world this way. And in this way, they pursue their goals, looking at this world. So here is literally such a difference.
Yes, one more sentence. Washington has become somewhat intoxicated by our independence. I would rather say that it was suddenly struck by the exploding Russian independence because the West did not properly note and interpret. This is how I see it, the words. Putin at the Security Conference in Munich in 2007 or 2008, when he clearly stated that the West is the enemy of Russia.
Here I was looking for the right word for what Jodorov said, and intoxicated in the Russian sense that he was unable to understand this independence, like how you are so, not surprised, but also the intoxication caused him to be unable to react. It's really such a metaphor, both surprise and expectation. Without the ability to react, meaning you are so weak, so intoxicated by our independence that you are unable to respond to our independence in a decisive way.
I associate a Russian word for this. And there was a Benu.
Yes, exactly. And there was a white one. So this is one of the, I wanted to show the meaning of this statement in the translation.
Well then, next. One more conclusion from the sad story of the fall of the Soviet Union. The West understands nothing but strength and talks on equal terms. As soon as we start behaving conciliatorily, we are finished. If you still want to use war terms for the current conflict with the West, you should understand a few things. Well, let's leave that one aside. But this threesome, talking about it. From what position they believe one should talk to the West, I immediately recall how we see it here, that Russia does not respect anyone who is not sufficiently strong or audacious.
But because it does not talk on equal terms, right?
Yes, and here they claim that one must talk to the West in such a way as to never behave conciliatorily towards it, because otherwise we will lose. So even if they have miserable cards, they will keep trying to bluff.
And I'll tell you something, in my work I've dealt with people from the East many times, and I can honestly say that everything I asked for was ignored. But what I demanded from a position of law and strength, so to speak, was always done to the letter. But that is in their nature. And that's how they perceive the world. That's how they function in business relationships as well, in private and other matters, and that's how their state operates too. One must understand this mentality. I am, of course, generalizing quite a bit, but this is a certain social, political, and economic trend in every aspect. And here, Fyodorov also speaks in relation to interstate relations.
So how would you put it? Either strength or audacity and the appropriate way of acting. No one could ever deny them their imagination, so they were able to find and apply it within themselves. So now, these definitions that come into play, if you still want to apply wartime terms to the current conflict with the West, you should understand a few things. First of all, of course we can try to defeat the USA by moving the war into a hot phase, but then it will end in a global crisis with no predictable winners. By the way, Khrushchev was the last one who dreamed of the existential destruction of the USA. After him, all Soviet and Russian leaders sought a comfortable coexistence with Washington.
Comfortable, meaning
Profitable. We have our own, they have theirs, each to their own. The appropriate policy is maintained all the time. There is such communication, but both sides do their own business and everyone is satisfied. And it has been like this for a long time.
yes, of course.
Only the cleverer ones in all of this were the Russians because they tied Austria first, then Germany, and subsequently other European countries through gas sales. And they were able to impose the narrative about what is good and what is not, and to bind the European Union so tightly for such a long time economically and in the energy sector, significantly weakening it from within and its ties and relations within NATO, which went unnoticed in the West. This served as a cover for the powerful strengthening of Russian intelligence. We are talking here about documented American materials from 2 years ago, from January 2023, detailing how hundreds of millions of euros and dollars were sent to pro-environmental organizations, political activities, and so on. All of this in the process, in doing business, in a comfortable coexistence with Washington.
Well, you see, as you might have noticed, it's actually starting to happen very slowly indeed. The change of the defense minister to a new one calls to Washington, to Asia, 3 times. 3 times in a sermon from Washington for Kiev to either not do something or to do something. Well, it's already, you slightly open the door and they'll put a foot in and that's it. And those will be the children. And also pay attention that it wasn't like, listen, don't do it, pay attention to this. No, you shouldn't do it because it will end in this and that.
The guy demands, expects, and has the right, such as...
Yes, exactly.
Such are their words.
So here, to be honest, nothing has changed. You have to know how to play against such an opponent if they send such sharp and curved balls. You need to be able to adjust the right game to that.
And now there is one more nice sentence. This, more convenient, method of functioning with Washington means taking into account the majority of the interests of the Soviet Union. And now one. Let us remember that the interest of the Soviet Union was not only completely opposed, but the ultimate point of its interest was to carry the revolution to the borders of the known and unknown world, and to dominate that world.
I'll tell you this, maybe it was so with Khrushchev, but later, after Khrushchev, all these tendencies regarding ideological confrontation were somewhat flattened to the issue of just such equal treatment and a convenient approach to conducting politics that takes into account the interests of the Soviet Union. The United States did not agree to this. They stated that no, the states continued in this ideological struggle because they knew that sooner or later it could end badly for them. So they disarmed the Soviet Union of its satellites and its power, for which Russia still experiences these phantom pains. Exactly, phantom pains. You can take advantage of the same situation knowing that the United States is no longer as involved as before, and a few more powers are emerging around.
I will allow myself to explain for those who may not know the concept of phantom pains. That means, if someone has had a limb amputated for a very long time, and sometimes for the rest of their life, that person can feel pain in that limb, which is no longer there, as it has been removed. So these phantom pains here refer to all those countries, the so-called demolished states, which were in a tight sphere of influence. And under the de facto Soviet administration, those countries no longer exist, but the dream of power in Moscow in this regard still exists, and they would like to, in these countries, even though they are already members of NATO and the European Union, to deal the cards in terms of power, military, and economy. And these are their phantom pains, as described here in detail by Maciej. All right, now we have another condition that Mr. Fedorov provided. Secondly, victory in this war will be the designation of Russia as an equal player on the world stage with its inviolable sphere of influence. Then the proverbial red lines for the West will be much more visible and non-negotiable. The special operation in Ukraine is precisely one of the acts of this strategy. And here we have done a reference to several issues from the last 3 years.
Yes, exactly.
Because those red lines, as soon as you defend too much, we have here nuclear weapons. As soon as you help Ukraine, we have nuclear weapons. As soon as hostile tanks appear, we will do something else. As soon as you give them long-range weapons, then, and those red lines were gradually, step by step, removed by the West, but they did have their effect as they slowed down the process of helping and supporting Ukraine, which helped Russia to organize itself militarily. So it's not that they simply disappeared. No, they fulfilled their role as, how should I put it, obstacles and a minefield, slowing down actions and giving arguments to those who were afraid of helping Ukraine. What could this provoke?
Exactly. Here, the whole point is already shown. This war is actually a certain stage in the development of capabilities. This is not something existential. Although Russia treats this war and confrontation as something existential. But we are not talking about a war strictly with Ukraine, but rather about the war in general, about positioning. Among all these countries distributing certain global benefits. And at the moment, Russia is losing a lot this, but says this is my, but he says this is our stage. It is going better or worse for them, but this is a stage towards achieving that. They looked at the long term, that after this war, regardless of how it ends, whether lost or won, because if the war ends, whether lost, they will remodel the way of conducting this war to a more effective one. But is Russia really on a downward slope, losing this war? Well, I think there is still room for maneuver here and they can win, but there are also many dangers from which they could lose. In any case, this is certainly not a war yet lost for Russia, nor indeed a victory for us. But the fact that we will defeat it, or somehow stop it, will not change the approach to this policy. That is my conclusion.
It must be said that this war does a few things. It currently provides a suitable cover to fix certain things in Russia. As significant, deficiencies and deficits have become very glaring. The sources of deficits and pathologies, so the purges that are being carried out, are going in that direction. Second, a certain technicization and computerization of the country to manage everyone and everything for the needs of the special military operation will also effectively strengthen this country, the system of oppression, but fundamentally the state as such. Furthermore, the country is getting rid of its least valuable citizens in this operation, even reducing the social and economic costs are being brutalized here now, but they approach it very pragmatically, cleansing their society. They may succeed in reversing the trends related to the change in their demographic structure, and they may manage to some extent to stop the influx of these migrants of all types from Central and Eastern Asia, or from the Caucasus, that they will handle it differently, also cleansing the situation in their security sectors, etc. And what else? They will increase the level of autonomy of their industry, which will also be significant for the future, as it will be less susceptible to potential sanctions as such. But the last thing in all of this, they are opening up to cooperation with those they have already collaborated with, but not to such an extent. They are starting to give away their ancestral silver and similar things to those allies who are able to pay for it. And here comes the increase in the role of China and its companies and access to natural resources, but there is also something related to India in all of this. Indeed, India has just received a very strong warning from the Americans that their banks will soon face secondary sanctions if they do not stop. In cooperation with Russian companies. So we will see. But India has its own policy here. They will not agree to everything the Americans want and will continue to do business up to the very possible breaking point where they would be told that it has gone too far, but they will make the most of it. And here Russia is. It will emerge to some extent from this war, organizationally stronger, economically weaker, socially very much shaken, but perhaps unfortunately more homogeneous. The siege mentality that they are currently living and functioning with may fuel the current Russian authorities for a long time. That is my opinion.
This is one of the main modus operandi of the Russian Federation that you, as you correctly pointed out, here you basically dissected their concept of conducting relations down to notes and half notes, but you also showed the geopolitical environment in which the Russian Federation operates. I am not a specialist in geopolitics, but I, in my honest opinion, consider Fedorov's statement here as a compass that, as I say, best shows what the Russian Federation intends in a geopolitical sense. I am not a geopolitical expert. I do not engage in such research, but I draw from the studies of others, from the conclusions and research of other people who deal with this, whether from the West or the East. Here, this Russian analyst is, in my opinion, for me, the person who, in the most precise manner, defined this. What happens below the area of the tools that Russia uses to practice this geopolitics, the tools that I am already dealing with and trying to study and break down into notes. And I am very concerned that Russia has accelerated its internal transformations, because war always accelerates such internal economic and social matters, especially in this period in the military area. Adapting to its shortcomings, but enough to meet the challenges defined here in these few paragraphs part of Fedorov's statements. So, for me, this is a kind of benchmark for Russian policy.
I will say one more thing, concluding this thread. How difficult it is and what knowledge, understanding, and even language proficiency it requires to identify such very important fragments of statements from many significant Russian opinion-forming individuals to catch this, understand it, and warn about what kind of burden such statements carry. Chapeau ba Maciej for finding this. It reminds me of a fragment of a book, I think it was Kocho or We, one of the two, where Americans, the CIA, practiced their language, knowledge of Russian, among other things, by watching various films in the original Russian, and they noticed changes in the texts that they knew perfectly well. It was about Eisenstein's films glorifying how Russian national myths were created. And after hearing the new sounds of the altered texts, they concluded that the Soviet propaganda apparatus had initiated some important actions as it prepares society for something in this way. For some unnoticed, but it already aims to shape perception and create a single way of thinking and the interpretation of certain phenomena by the Russian nation. And such phishing is very important.
So now imagine that indeed a long time ago, films were created in order to reach society. How many cinemas and people had to come by for it to be ingrained in social consciousness? And now there are different methods and much better. We are being attacked. The Russians are being attacked by various methods, which is why 500,000 victims did not derail the Russian Federation, while 15,000 victims of Afghanistan derailed the mighty Soviet Union. So here the truly significant and profound difference in impact and cementing of this society is enormous. So we must remember that.
And the second thread, Maciej, that I wanted to discuss with you is a certain systematics that you decided to introduce to us, because I also belong to those who still use the abbreviation GRU by default, in situations where this abbreviation is no longer entirely appropriate, but we all use it because it's a bit traditional. It has merged with the image of the Polish soldier for some, just like GRU with the symbol of military recognition and military intelligence in Russia. However, you revealed a glimpse of the mystery for some, showing how and in what time it has changed a bit. The question could even be raised, why did the Russians change it? What was bothering them? In what way did they want to distance themselves from the effective history of the GRU from the times of the Soviet Union? So I would like you to elaborate on this thread that you described nicely.
Basically, I invite you to that thread where I describe the GRU in general, maybe not so historically detailed, but pulling out some interesting bits regarding, among other things, why it is the main directorate and not the main intelligence directorate which functioned throughout the Soviet period. Why the main directorate? Because the form has changed a bit. Understanding of how the Russians perceive the acquisition of information from the battlefield for the military. The Russians, they have something like this, that intelligence, in our case, is divided. And here I ask you to explain to our viewers. Reconnaissance and intelligence. In our case, it is separated, right? And here I got to know, I would ask you to explain to our listeners what it's about.
First of all, it is about the organizational form and the level at which it is conducted. Reconnaissance provides information for intelligence as such. That's the first point. Intelligence can also share certain things with reconnaissance, but primarily the direction of information flow is from reconnaissance to intelligence. Additionally, reconnaissance has an organizational form of typically military units, meaning level, subunit, company, platoon, company. It can even be a reconnaissance battalion, and it has specific tasks that it carries out depending on the needs. In the enemy's rear, closer to the front, on the very front line. So these are combat and reconnaissance actions where the main principle is, as long as you are that reconnaissance platoon, which no one knows where it is, no one sees it, no one hears it, but it sees everything, hears everything, and reports on it as long as you fulfill your role. And if they detect you, you must detach from the enemy as quickly as possible, escape. But there are also priority tasks. Because if such a reconnaissance subunit finds a priority target, a staff, or an anti-aircraft or artillery unit, it can also carry out a combat mission, meaning try to destroy such an important target. However, that is not its priority. Meanwhile, intelligence as such is engaged in gathering information, analysis, processing, drawing conclusions, and presenting all of this upwards. Additionally, it does this both actively as well as passively. Passively, meaning from all possible sources that can provide information to it. And actively, meaning sending its own agents to acquire sources or directly influence and obtain that information. The scale of operation, here there are subunits, often dozens of people, sometimes just one person, but in the right place, acting and being used in the right way. However, in other places, there is a fusion of all this, because a properly trained reconnaissance soldier can also be a person used for intelligence purposes. What is better? I won't venture to make such an assessment, but I agree that reconnaissance, so-called general military reconnaissance, and the way it is carried out, is the right name and method of operation for us. However, intelligence should have the ability, if necessary, to utilize all reconnaissance tools if such a need arises,
And indeed, the main directorate was established in 2010, at least in name. It is in a way a result of the Russian approach to intelligence reconnaissance. I call it that, because they combined intelligence reconnaissance into one mass. As you mentioned, that there are two schools, so to speak. I call it combined reconnaissance. So, why combined reconnaissance? Because it has intelligence features, meaning all elements for special services, for intelligence with all those operational capabilities and comprehensive capabilities, but also that general military reconnaissance. The main directorate of the GRU was more of an intelligence service than a reconnaissance and special operations service, because there they combined reconnaissance and special activities. Specnas used to fall under the GRU, and to this day some analyses and some believe that it is under the GRU, which is not true, but I will talk about that shortly. At least the GRU, the main directorate. The main directorate was created from the idea of combined reconnaissance, merging elements of intelligence and reconnaissance under one unit, namely the main directorate. And there, all these matters gained strength, essentially, until 2014-2016. The head of this entire idea was General Sergun, by the way, a legend of the Russian military. Intelligence, the head of that intelligence. Interestingly, his deputy was Dunin.
And they were one of the two assistants to the president.
Currently, yes. And they created the concept of combined reconnaissance, merging intelligence information with general military reconnaissance to provide their commanders with advantages on the battlefield. They stated that they are unable to compete with Western technology as a state when it comes to confrontations, but at the lowest levels below the threshold of war, if they have full information, what will happen to defeat any Western opponent despite their technological capabilities. And it went in two directions, specifically in the combined reconnaissance of 2010, where the main directorate was established precisely under Sergun, and the creation of special operations forces authored by Dunin, who was simultaneously the head of, he was the deputy head of the main directorate, that is, from Erdo, and at the same time the commander of the special operations forces being formed at that time. Then Senes was created, then Kubianka II, Sunflowers, etc., etc. All these units that are in this special sphere. And what else? To these units, special ones to this command of special operations forces, all executive elements went, which had the GRU, meaning all special forces were absorbed, at least until 2016-2017. It was absorbed by the special operations forces. Somewhere there, allow it to...
I will ask a question, because there are still units that are called the GRU Special Forces Brigade. There are still such units.
But that is an old name.
Old name, okay. All right, and will I now find a good example of such an informational fusion that the Russians wanted to achieve? So yes, intelligence officers directly assigned to some operational unit prepare operations in a given direction, meaning they must know everything that is happening there. What are these groups of social discontent? Who or where are the agents, other weak elements, what, where, how to use? One is the management layer of all this. Below is the executive general military reconnaissance, which would have no chance of knowing about such places, about such people, if he didn't receive it from intelligence. Normally the path would be too long. But if this is as a fusion at the level of that operational unit, I don't know, army group, army or fronts, they cooperate continuously. So this flow of information about these resources that this reconnaissance can use, I don't know, penetrating deep into the formation, conducting diversion, destroying important things, objects and so on, sowing confusion, because they may not have a technical advantage. But this information from intelligence is quickly available directly to those from reconnaissance who make direct use of it. And the effect of this can be positively beneficial for such an army group, or front that is to carry out an attack. and capture some important objects from the opponent, Russia.
And imagine that in every brigade, division, corps, or army, there is a reconnaissance command center of the main staff. There is none from the brigade in the shelves, unless there are some in certain shelves. But I know that there is definitely such a center at the brigade level and at the division, corps, army level, of course, and higher. And there, precisely, this officer of the main staff is the deputy commander of the brigade, and so on upwards regarding the command of this joint reconnaissance. And he provides all the information, manages general military reconnaissance, and can also manage agent activities in close frontline contact if there are any, because he has the predispositions and authority for that. And this
does not have access to such a base.
A center that essentially functions somewhat separately from the brigade, because it is not in the brigade's staff, to be clear. It is not a part of the brigade's staff, but a separate center. However, it is a unit that is to provide information support to the brigade commander at the tactical level. Tactical, somewhere there, the division commander at the tactical operational level, because a division can already conduct certain types of operations, right? Whether in the operational corps, an army also operational, and in the operational strategic grouping, right? And there, depending on the level, there is also the appropriate competence of a given officer, meaning he can manage this general military reconnaissance, but less so, for example, intelligence operations. A little higher, there is more operational reconnaissance, a bit more of the agent-based type, because it reaches a bit deeper. At the army level, there is also general military reconnaissance, but a large part is already deep and intelligence reconnaissance. Well, strategic is known and central is also known. And in this way, the projected military reconnaissance gives Russian commanders very great capabilities. Of course, it doesn't work perfectly everywhere, but the systemic solution is very well thought out and very practical regarding capabilities, because the Russians may not have equipment. They may have people, as it is evident. They do, but they must know. And they cannot be told, at least at the level of combat, that they do not know something on the other side. The Ukrainians really have to make a strong effort to hide their actions, because the Russians are also probing them. They know how and where to strike. There are documented cases. I don't want to provide that, because I usually don't publicly disclose how the Russians know where to strike the Ukrainians. But I also hope Maciej will confirm that SOW could be very effective and efficient in these operations. The Ukrainians could not feel...
Allow me to remind you of a few things. Among other things, at one time in Mykolaiv, a missile hit exactly the apartment of a Ukrainian oligarch involved in organizing grain trade and similar activities. A Russian missile, a cruise missile, flew perfectly into his bedroom window because they wanted to disrupt those fledgling attempts to create that grain corridor so that Ukraine would not be able to improve its export situation, meaning it wouldn't have money for the war. That's one. In the depths of the Jaworoi training ground. These actions had to be intelligence and reconnaissance, more intelligence that there at that time. The presence of many international instructors was noted, that there was also some data analytics center there, and so on. The Jaworoi training ground was attacked very close to the Polish border, closer to Poland than Lviv. Then there were also issues such as certain specific air bases where it was expected and anticipated that aircraft would appear in the very near future. Those few that still fought on the Ukrainian side, that also had to be from reconnaissance. Another matter, there were also restaurants, where officers from various units came quite often in the rear, which were also shelled. These are examples of how the Russians obtained information in various ways, and this applies to both reconnaissance and intelligence levels. Merger, overlay, appropriate targeting, decision-making, and attacks such as more than one Iskander flew to a target that was very precisely identified, prepared, and discussed by Russian reconnaissance and intelligence, and unfortunately, it successfully reached its target.
Do you know how much time it took from detecting the target for the Iskander, approximately at a depth of 300 kilometers, even above 300 kilometers, from the moment of detecting the target to initiating the entire process to striking the target, for example, in 2022, and how much now in 2024? What time?
In 2022, we are talking about even a day, because those were the times. The last part is unclear.
Exceeds a day.
Now, they can handle it in 2 hours.
No, in 20,000, in 20,000, in 20,000. The system we are discussing here is not something they invented during this war. It functioned earlier, but indeed, during peacetime it was very neglected, because there was no need to use it. At the beginning of the war, it turned out to be ineffective. Despite the basically ideal assumptions, it turned out to be ineffective. Certain things certainly had to be changed because there was undoubtedly fragmented reconnaissance into radio technical reconnaissance, and definitely general military reconnaissance, and electronic warfare reconnaissance. All these reconnaissance efforts were dispersed. Only then did they reach the center, which took too much time, so they took all the elements from the reconnaissance branches and gave them to the head of the center to manage everything, while also transferring direct fire tasks within the reconnaissance fire complex to the fire means that were to carry them out. So that was the change. During the war, this caused the artillery to fire, not with a half-hour or 15-minute interval on a detected target, but to start firing 5 to 6 minutes after detection. Now, Russian artillery fires at the detected target in about 5 to 6 minutes. No, from various... I can't hear you, Maciej. I understand that you mean barrel artillery here. Barrel artillery. Barrel artillery. Here, in this closer contact rather than distant, because both artillery stopped firing deeply, it should be noted. And here the targets are quite quick, both of them. They basically reached a level that the Ukrainians also had at the beginning of the war. Here there is a balance in terms of detection to strike. Of course, the Russians shoot much less accurately than the Ukrainians. And now we come to that element I told you about, which I asked you about, as previously mentioned. Strikes on targets around 2022 needed even up to a week to program and hit the targets when we talk about those newly detected targets, not planned ones, just detected. It even took up to a week to program and prepare the missiles for that. Due to technical problems, these inspections had to be done. It's not just about the detection and strike process itself, but also the entire process from the moment you unpack the missile to when you place it on the launcher. So you prepare for the type of attack that the specific target requires, because you need to change the warhead, whether it's a cluster warhead or a fragmentation one. Demolishing or penetrating, because you can also change the warhead in these missiles like...
In Iskander.
Well, in Iskander, and it took a day. I agree, it could also take about a day if all the equipment was prepared, or even up to a week. However, currently the Ukrainians themselves write that an Iskander strike at a depth of 300 kilometers from the moment of target detection and description by the Russians takes half an hour.
I heard about 2, you say half, I'm more afraid of that.
30 minutes from the moment it was set, it wasn't destroyed, because it is an important target, as a team specifically came to set up a model. And when the model was activated, it started to radiate accordingly, etc. Half an hour after activation, it received an Iskander. And that means there was nothing there. They just set it up, launched it, just half an hour, bam, strike. So that's, in general, approximately the time frame, roughly the time period. So, there are significant advances regarding these actions. But the system finally overcame these problems and started to function because the Russians haven't changed much in this regard. They changed a little regarding the functioning of Special Operations Command, as the Supreme Command of Special Operations was established, combining intelligence, special, and military operations. The mercenary corps also falls under the command of special operations, so this command is being prepared here.
Wow, you brought up a very important thing. This is what you also discussed in an interview with our colleague Piotrek for Polona. God, the Russians are absolutely taking full advantage of the benefits that the current situation in the world provides. So various types of mercenaries, recruitment under a foreign flag, you also called it hooded recruitment, where someone is not fully aware of whose tool they are. And if they have handed it over to military intelligence and reconnaissance, one can expect.
The Special Operations Command also includes the FSB, SWR. This entity created all elements related to intelligence and military activities, and it is not directly under the Ministry of Defense, but operates jointly with the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and other ministries.
In short, someone strong enough, meaning Red, Putin, said that you should bury your childish, competitive interests, because if you don't start cooperating, I will take care of you. It must have been that way for them to sit down and start cooperating. Unfortunately, the effects of synergy are visible.
Yes, exactly, because there are no more such blunders and competition causing unhealthy rivalry among Russian services. Putin simply pacified that, but the first pacification he carried out was in 2020, when he didn't really make any major revolution, but simply organized the work of the FSB, which did not perform well in terms of assessment and execution of the special operation in Ukraine. And here the FSB suffered greatly in the sense that it had to give up many of its feudal positions that it previously held as a service.
The main directorate also took a hit because it was responsible for the close reconnaissance that was.
The FSB was generally responsible for the entire operation. For the main intelligence directorate, that is, the main directorate or military intelligence operated as an institution, executing orders for the FSB. This was not very pleasing to the management, so they probably didn't.
Bullshit.
They didn't do that. Besides, the entire military operation wasn't properly prepared from a military standpoint without maintaining reserves, appropriate mobilization system activation, restoring the readiness of the provinces. They were simply supposed to arrive to the ready things that the FSB had prepared there as part of its special operation. So, even most of the losses of the special units were suffered by the special units of the FSB that operated there, rather than the special units subordinate to the special operation forces. Of course, they would also participate there, but as subcontractors for certain operations. This was supposed to be Shoigu's success and his idea for capturing Ukraine. He wanted to do the same as Junin with Sargon in 2014, which is a beautiful capture of Crimea without a single shot, essentially, without a single casualty. Here he wanted to do something similar, which would solidify his position and possibly his future role as president, but it didn't succeed. And above all, it was supposed to be a big business because Ukraine, for his people, after all, Crimea gave a lot, Donbas gave a lot, fortune for some Russian warlords, and Ukraine would simply be El Dorado. And now these businessmen are suffering, being imprisoned for corruption. Of course, Shoigu will not be removed, at least in the near future, in this way. Possibly he will fall out of the window, but his people below are simply being cut down in a way brutal as for Russia towards its own elite, because they are being imprisoned by prosecutors for crimes, which shows others that one must not do business with Shoigu, because Shoigu will not protect his people. And this also has the appropriate,
very important message.
A message, and punishing Shoigu for the failure regarding Ukraine. Unfortunately, there is.
But you see, right now there was a situation where Shoigu, as the Secretary of the Security Council, wanted to rearrange certain things and take something from the Ministry of Emergency Situations. It's also a strange creation of strange things, combining many strange elements. Well, I personally interpret this as an attempt to secure some possible income to cover the losses he currently has. But he also got caught.
Yes, yes. Well, no, he is already, he is already in, let's say, a golden cage at the moment. So here, no, I'll be honest, no one will get into business with Shoigu because he doesn't protect his people. In Russia, there is one rule: I am under you, but you protect me, and I am real towards you. Shoigu is not able to protect the people who are being locked up from the general staff right now.
In Russian, the Krishadam will immobilize the robot.
Exactly.
It is such a protective umbrella. That's how it can be interpreted.
Still, there is one more issue regarding the main management. So this main management, in fact, it has now become the most important intelligence service in Russia, because it not only knows what is happening on the front, as the SWR does not know this, and the FSB does not know too much either. It has full awareness of what is happening on the front, what is happening in the units, because they have their people from the bottom to the top, so to speak, of the front. In addition, they have deep intelligence operations and also intelligence operations in NATO countries. And in fact, now Kyostyukin, the current admiral commanding the main management, is one of the most powerful people knowing what is happening, and he is one of the proteges of Sergun and Dunin.
But I have a specific question here, because the name itself, main management of what? Not of the ministry, but of the general staff, right?
Of the general staff.
So in fact, looking from the outside, since the general staff is divided into various managements and so on, and this is the main management, the only one that is called that, it is effectively handing over the general staff into the hands of military intelligence.
Well, I wouldn't say that, because the overarching body planning all operations is indeed the Supreme Command of Special Operations, and I don't know how it functions, whether it is under the ministry or if it is some kind of entity between all the ministries, because that is not exactly clear. There is also no designated head, specifically for this Supreme Command. At least I have not encountered such statements officially anywhere. Of course, there is a commander of the Special Operations Forces with the rank of 1-star general, which does not mean that he is not whether he is not at the head of this Supreme Command of Special Operations, because it is hard to say that a 1-star Russian general would be the commander of such a structure where there is the main management, that is military intelligence. I am talking about military intelligence in relation to the main management, although, as I said, there are those reconnaissance elements. We are talking about the FSB, we are talking about the SWR, we are talking about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other ministries that support the operation.
Exactly. You pointed out strongly that the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been directly and very seriously harnessed to support these actions. Everyone knows, of course, that there are Russian spies at every diplomatic mission, but that was, so to speak, forced in another way. However, here and now, all resources of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if necessary, are to be made available from what has been learned recently for the main management to use.
And now this last reform that took place, such changes, means that all reconnaissance units are subordinate to the main management, that is, this element of those centers, meaning all these reconnaissance. However, special units, the Spetsnaz, are subordinate to the command, the Supreme Command of Operations. Special units are not under the command of Special Operations Forces, as they have other units under them that are not part of the armed forces, such as Senes, Kubianka II, and other units. So it was also divided to ensure that military intelligence is not too powerful. The idea is to prevent any one service from suddenly having everything, although it is now the most oriented regarding what is happening in this dimension. And the Russians, there is just one caveat. Separate other special units of airborne troops, which are not under the command of operations, the Supreme Command of Special Operations, but are subordinate to the command of the type of troops, namely Spetsnaz from the airborne forces and Spetsnaz from the Navy. It is subordinate to the command of the Navy, while the airborne forces are under the command of airborne troops. So these are two elements, as well as Spetsnaz from the strategic forces. It is also not subordinate to the elements of the Supreme Command, nor to Spetsnaz from individual services such as the SWR and FSB, and Spetsnaz from the National Guard and the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which are also not under the command of the Supreme Command of Special Operations. Instead, there is a separate Special Operations Center for the National Guard and the Ministry of Internal Affairs, where the management is located. They also operate internally but cooperate with the Supreme Command because the Supreme Command is for external operations. Everything that is external, however, for example, the Rosgvardia, in its Special Operations Command also has a volunteer corps made up of mercenaries under its command, just like the Supreme Command does, only for internal actions because there you have all the mercenaries who left the Wagner Group and did not want to join the military from various military commands, but instead went under Złotów and his National Guard. There the first volunteer corps was also formed. And within the military structures managed by the Supreme Command of Special Operations, the first Expeditionary Volunteer Corps was established, which is currently fighting in Ukraine.
It's complicated, as similar elements appear on many levels, but looking at it this way, in the event of a higher state of necessity, even a higher state of necessity than the current special operation, it could turn out that if they start gathering units and organizational structures with similar skills, they would accumulate a lot of them.
Listen, I calculated that including these mercenaries, starting from the lowest level, I did not count reconnaissance units, because I separated the reconnaissance units, only the Spetsnaz units subordinate to the Supreme Command of Special Operations, meaning I did not count the VDV Spetsnaz, and I did not count the Special Naval Fleet, and I did not count those Spetsnaz of individual services and the Guard and the National Guard of the Ministry of Urban Affairs, only the military Spetsnaz itself. Yes, Spetsnaz plus the Special Operations Command, meaning what is there, Senesh and Kubianka and other units. I calculated that they have about 80 to 90,000 bayonets, so to speak, when it comes to
80 to 90,000 soldiers. And
about the operators, with the fact that there are about 3,000 such strictly Spetsnaz operators, like those, with black tactics, meaning on the border of special military intelligence. However, such heavy Spetsnaz, the frontline type, is between approximately 10 and 15,000. The rest are such Spetsnaz, let's say, for one time. Heavy use, also frontline, but more like a rapid response team, not deep, rather for sporting actions, perhaps.
let's supplement this entire assault, heavy, exceptionally good, rarer, and even super, extra, hyper, in this quantity of 80, 90,000. They are much more motivated, with better morale soldiers, certainly better paid, better equipped. This is something that is more than the Polish ground forces.
But they have tanks after all. They have tanks. Yes, they have all of them. They have aircraft.
They have everything they need. To make it clear someday, the Polish anti-terrorist company had planned that if needed, it could even have a T-72 tank, the anti-terrorist company, in the police if such a need arose. However, it was never practiced, but in theory, it could have had it if it wanted.
The Guard has tank subunits in its structure.
It has tank subunits because if the Guard is to ensure internal security and maintain power, it sometimes needs all the tools to defend that power. So it is clear. Look at the amount. Additionally, the expanding VDV forces were supposed to reach another 40,000 before the war. They lost a lot, but I think that again in the range between 30,000 and 40,000, the VDV managed to rebuild.
Up to 150,000 even.
Well, they are already training more, developing units, which shows you that in a short time, even up to $150,000, highly qualified.
We haven't counted the Marine Infantry yet, which is also being developed. Brigades are being expanded.
And they want to make something like the VDV from it in terms of esprit de corps and similar. Only the Chinese might have more special forces, but I don't know if they have that many.
No, I think that when it comes to management, the Russians call it multimodal forces, that is, capable of operating in various aspects of conflict. From hybrid, meaning it's unclear who is attacking, little green men, to balanced, meaning we attack you, but we are not yet making it a hot war, to a larger scale where they can cooperate with those regular mass forces, so to speak, maybe not technologically advanced, but binding, for example, their mass significance potential against the opponent, while those forces can carry out precise strikes at the focal point in order to achieve success. The first, so to speak, signs of such a multimodal grouping combining both heavy forces and special forces is the grouping of General Kapitan, which was established, later taken over by General Mordeyevich, and based on the grouping center, such a formation was created, a grouping of courage from two armies, from two Spetsnaz brigades, artillery, from mercenary units with a large amount of reconnaissance equipment, further saturated with missile strikes. Well, everything top-notch, was gathered specifically for two armies, for two brigades, precisely two Spetsnaz brigades. And such a grouping first fought in October near Kremiena. And suddenly it turned out that it was breaking through and capturing Avdiivka. And now we see the effects of this strike, this grouping of brave General Modrovichev, where they are simply pushing into the Ukrainian fortifications near Avdiivka. And they are doing it quite effectively given the level of combat presented. At this stage of the war, there is the largest...
This explains a lot. If, firstly, the level of saturation with special units is, as you say, it would be foolish. I doubt they would forget about it. If they didn't take advantage of it to learn something from them, even in the area of those operational troops that exist, because they have their own, so to speak, frontline schools and small training centers all the time, and they definitely did that as well. And here, Mordvichev is currently demonstrating effectiveness in those directions where it is, as well as good utilization of Ukrainian mistakes, because the basis of all current Russian successes are Ukrainian errors.
He is one of the few generals who personally received an award from Putin in the Kremlin for the capture of Avdiivka, for creating this grouping with many Dominicans. He received the Hero of Russia award, but it wasn't from the ministry. It wasn't given to him by a minister, but he was personally invited to the Kremlin in the Senate Palace, where he received the medal from Putin. Putin does not often award soldiers in this way, even his highest generals, unless it is the Minister of Defense. Because only Putin can award the Minister of Defense. Below, Putin has never bent down like that to hand someone a medal. So this indicates how it was received.
There was a time when we bet that Teplinsky could also receive such things, such distinctions, but that probably won't happen now, at least for the time being. It is still unknown whether he is alive or not, but he did a really good job at some point by organizing this defense and providing the basis for further Russian offensive actions. These are facts, and he reestablished the airborne troops.
His two divisions saved Zaporizhia, one could say, because the Ukrainians were really close in this Zaporizhia offensive, truly.
It was very close, precisely. We will not describe here in detail how exactly the current general staff is organized, how many departments it has, and similar things. In any case, the most important thing is all of this. The Russians developed it because they started certain reforms earlier, significantly improving the level of these reforms, enhancing the work of those responsible for reconnaissance and intelligence services, greatly raising the level of coordination, involving other services where necessary, establishing a proper forum for information exchange and coordination, the Supreme Command of Special Operations, and similar things. The effectiveness of actions in this area of the Russians is indeed increasing. And it complements very well the doctrine, the strategy we talked about earlier, executed by Mr. What was his name? Fedorov. It really complements well as a tool, and unfortunately, there is something to be respected. It is also a clear indicator of why Poland must have sufficiently large special forces of our own because, as they say, a thief is best caught by another thief. If we know that the Russians have such an extensive setup, but they are not able to deploy all of them to one place at the same time, remember, we also need to have well-developed, prepared, and aware forces. Special forces, our special troops, to be able to counter all these Russian efforts and also eliminate their effects and consequences. And this multi-domain approach, properly defined by us, should also function in all of this. Although I don't see that we need to have tanks, like their smaller special forces in this area, but rather appropriately, technologically, appropriately, also cybernetically, and specifically in straightforward military issues. We need to have this. We must have it sufficiently large and effective.
We have no other choice. We must realize that special commands in the West must have a completely different character than they have had. So far, when our command was planning and executing stabilization operations, where it fought in a comfort zone, we had access to reconnaissance, medical evacuation, air support, etc., etc. The upcoming conflict in such a balanced war or in a hybrid war will deprive us of that comfort, support. So we need to build all of this and learn, for example, to fight with one hand tied behind our back and without one leg sometimes due to the fact that the opponent who strikes will always have the advantage in choosing the place and method. He will always have the advantage. In the first contact, we will always be without that advantage. We need to learn to act a little. Ground forces or air forces are forces that must have the appropriate potential so as not to force us to fear the military potential of Russia. However, when Russia sees that it will not be able to intimidate us militarily in conventional terms, it will also try, of course, in nuclear terms. But this should also be treated as a kind of political pressure because, as I said, Russia's nuclear weapon is a defensive weapon in a broad general sense, and I have often tried to prove this with my analyses. However, the forces managed by the Supreme Command of Special Operations will be very offensive. Not to be confused with the Command of Special Operations Forces, because they have the Command of Special Military Operations in Ukraine. This is a completely different form where it will manage this sub-threshold struggle below the threshold of war, below the threshold of such a conflict, and will be able to do it for a long time. Our commands, they must realize that we will be operating against a very aware opponent who will have outsourcing in task execution because they can do it through other hands, can operate through the saturation of certain capabilities, saturating our capabilities with intelligence, special military or mercenary actions, which will force us to see police forces, military rescue or intelligence, counterintelligence to counteract this. I don't know if we are able to coordinate all of this under one hand and one concept of use in different scenarios. We need to learn this.
And finally, to conclude, one must remember one thing. Unfortunately, we need to separate the gray mass of Russian soldiers, operational troops, and mobics from the definitely more intelligent and consistent people forming these intelligence and reconnaissance forces at the same time. In all of this, what you wrote at the end of your material, ruthless. And we need to prepare for war with them beyond dogmas and using non-obvious methods because they do not think in a template way at all. This is a certain momentum, but also a warning in this regard. And it's good that people like you who have worked where you have talk about this because we need to prepare ourselves for this in many directions, many dimensions. But we always have to start with awareness.
Well, yes, but this is, as you might expect, a definite and specific projection based solely on some red open sources. Of course, it may differ greatly from that reality. Western intelligence services certainly have a fuller picture of this, and their analyses are more substantial in details. For decision-making by decision-makers, I count on that, so I just wanted to indicate the full direction here in a journalistic way, not necessarily indicating that such a thing is taking place. I base it only on my experiences and on what is officially available in the generally understood information circulation.
Thank you very much, Maciej, for the over-hour-long material regarding the strategic elements of the actions of the Russian Federation and one of the most important tools for implementing the Russian strategy, which is currently traditionally called the GRU, now the main directorate of the General Staff, which has probably never been as powerful as it is now.
I do not remember during the times of the Soviet Union and the modern Russian Federation such extensive capabilities and now the competencies that the main directorate has.
It didn't exactly inspire optimism, but this was supposed to be real information, which is what we focused on. If you liked it, I encourage you to like, comment, and share. Subscribe to the Kapitan Lisowski channel, follow our social media, including Colonel Maciej KOROWAJ's accounts on Twitter, as well as Kapitan Lisowski. I also encourage supporting the channel in every possible way, supporting our creativity, if such possibilities are indicated in the journalistic materials. And well, we do this for you. If you liked it, you know what to do. We wish you a pleasant weekend. We bid farewell to everyone, and Colonel Maciej KOROWAJ says thank you very much. And Maciej Kapitan Lisowski. To everyone, until we hear from each other, until we see each other, bye.